Appreciate everybody joining us again for VCE Ag Today this Thursday morning, November 18th, 2021. Topic of discussion this morning is going to be fall armyworm, a 2021 recap from this past fall and late summer. Very excited to have a great panel on board with us this morning. A lot of knowledge and information to be shared. Our guest speakers this morning are going to be Dr. Mike Goatley, our Turfgrass Extension Specialist, Dr. Tom Kuhar, our Extension Vegetable Entomologist, Dr. Katie Payne, our Applied Forage System Specialist, and Dr. Sally Taylor, our Field Crops Entomologist. So hopefully from some of those titles, you can gather that we're going to share information on how fall armyworm impacts a lot of different cropping systems, horticultural systems, and so forth. So again, appreciate everyone joining us this morning. We still got some folks joining, so we'll continue to allow those people to enter into the meeting. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. As always, if you could please remain muted throughout the presentation, be greatly appreciated, just to avoid any disruptions or background noise. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll open it up for some questions and discussion. If you happen to have a question throughout the presentation, if you just enter that into the chat window, we'll definitely address those at the end as well. So without further ado, I think we'll just go ahead and get started. I think Dr. Kuhar is going to kick us off this morning with a presentation on some general background. So Dr. Kuhar, if you want to share your screen, we'll go ahead and get started.
All righty. I'll see if this comes up. Okay, can everybody see the slides and hear me?
Yeah, Tom, we can see the slides. It just shows it in kind of working mode in PowerPoint. You may have to switch it over to presentation mode.
All right, how about that?
Perfect. That'll work.
All righty, well, thank you. So yeah, I'm gonna, we're not all entomologists, but we all probably dealt a little bit with fall armyworm, or at least heard about it this year. So I'm going to start by at least bringing us all up to speed with what this beast is, and a little bit about its biology and what we found out this year. So fall armyworm is a noctuid moth, so in that same family as corn earworm, and it's one of many armyworms that we can find in Virginia. This one happens to be tropical, so it's not one that we're supposed to have in Virginia, but we do get it on occasion. So yeah, it's a tropical moth, so it cannot overwinter in Virginia, and really it can't overwinter in too much of the United States. It's in South Texas and the southern reaches of Florida where you will actually have the overwintering populations. But get into late July, it's possible that fall armyworm shows up in our state like we saw this year. A little bit about its biology and why it can be so damaging when it does show up. Incredible ability to deposit eggs. You can see an egg mass has anywhere from 100 to 200 eggs, and they are covered by protective scales. So that kind of reduces any kind of predation that might happen on these eggs that could happen to those eggs if they weren't covered. So you get high survival, high egg hatch. As you can see in that slide to the right, just hundreds of tiny hungry caterpillars that can emerge from a single egg mass. And that's why you get this army of caterpillars. They will devour whatever food they're on and then move on to the next thing. By the way, egg masses, they prefer to lay them on plants, but they are not choosy. And I know Mike Goatley's on the call here, and he's probably seen this. They actually quite often will lay eggs on the flags on golf courses. They are drawn to them, especially white flags. I've seen it on a number of occasions. You see that egg mass right there in the bottom corner. So they're not choosy. It doesn't even have to be a plant. They will just deposit that egg mass near their food source. So once those eggs hatch, they will go through 6 larval instars, so they just keep getting larger and larger with each molt. And that complete generation from adult to adult can take anywhere from 30 to 40 days. So yes, if they get here early enough in Virginia, like we saw this year, they can go through more than one generation. And that's exactly what we saw here in 2021. Just in case you're wondering how to identify fall armyworm, there's a lot of caterpillars that you might find on crops and on turf. Some key characters. One, unlike corn earworm, which has a lot of hairs on it, this is kind of naked. You don't see a lot of hairs on fall armyworm. It's pretty smooth. On the tail end of it, on the second to the last body segment, you will see these black spots, and then you can see there they basically form a square. That's one key character, but then on the other side of it, the head, if you look straight at it, there's an inverted Y that's white color. So you can see that in the bottom slide. That's pretty indicative of the fall armyworm. Not too many other of our caterpillars are going to have that. And then the eyes kind of have this net-like pattern, as you can see in the slide too. So if you have all those characters, it's a pretty good indication that it's fall armyworm. But the thing that usually jumps out is that you don't find just one. When you find fall armyworm, you find the army, and that's an indication too that this is an armyworm, and it's probably that one. So one thing that's interesting, and this does affect its biology, it affects the host plants that it feeds on. Could definitely affect things like resistance to BT and resistance to other insecticides. And that is that we may get fall armyworms from different locations. And you can see like two major winter breeding areas of fall armyworm where they're breeding year round. So you got your Caribbean islands, and then South Florida is kind of, if you want to consider that one major population or strain, and then you got that Mexico, South Texas. And it is possible that, well, very likely that in Virginia we get a mix. We may get, depending where you're at, you may get one or the other, or you may be in an area where you get both. So you can see kind of the typical, and I'm going to say migratory, but that's really not a true term. It's winds blowing these moths, and typical prevailing winds during late summer. And those are kind of like the directions that you follow. So anything could happen. Storms could really change this pattern a little bit. But that's just something to keep in mind, that you've got a genetic population, two completely distinct ones, and they're basically sending their moths up, which could really leave us with a mixed bag here in Virginia when they get here in late summer. So, okay, some of it's host plants. So this is where it gets a little confusing too, because you could have different strains of fall armyworm. There's one that's called the rice and one that's called the corn. That's simplifying it way too much, but the rice strain seems to be one where Bermuda grass and those kind of things, the grasses, it really loves to feed on. And then there's the other strain, especially the one we're getting from Florida, where when it shows up, corn and sorghum are typically the crops that you're going to see it in. So this year, I really think we had a lot of the rice strain, if you want to call it that, but I think it got a little more confusing and a little more complicated than that. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But the one thing I did not see, and I'll be interesting when we have our conversation, how much we saw in corn and sorghum, because I didn't see any in those crops, and I had them out. So I'll be really interested to hear that. What do they do? These larvae will consume all above ground plant parts. So the leaves and things in turf, they will kill that growing point on the plant as they consume the leaves. And that ends up in actually killing the grass and having complete dead spots. You know, the big thing that we saw this year. Okay, like I said, so in my career, aside from 2016, which was another year, 2018, I think it was, 2018, I had always seen fall armyworm show up. And if we had corn and sorghum out there, that was going to be the crop that indicated that, yeah, we've got fall armyworm this year, especially late planted corn. That was always the place that it showed up. And that's because we were probably getting the corn strain in typical years. This year, as many of you know, some of you sent some of these pictures. It was turf, and it was turf in the kind of the Richmond area, I think, first, that just lawns completely destroyed overnight. And this was a large number of lawns. And it was something that had happened earlier than I had ever seen, and a lot of my colleagues had ever seen. So we had fall armyworms that got here early, and really were concentrating on that fescue, tall fescue that was in these lawns. That was the thing that really got hammered early and with a vengeance. And as you see some of these pictures here, we saw it in Blacksburg as well. This is the VT golf course, and so the fairways were protected with an insecticide that they put down for white grubs, and it also controls fall armyworm. So those were clean, but running right up to the rough that was not sprayed, you saw the rough completely destroyed, and that happened very quickly. Some other interesting things we saw is that it seemed to be concentrating on fescue. It was really curious. It was like that was the one plant it was hitting. That was early on. And then later, I think we saw a lot of other different crops hit. The other thing that was peculiar was that it seemed to just consume the fescue and leave behind other plants that are supposed to be in its host plant range. Things like crabgrass, like they didn't even touch it. It's almost like they would starve before eating those things, which is really unusual because they should be able to eat those plants without any problem. But that's what we saw, as you can see in this picture. And this wasn't one isolated case. This was a lot of people reporting very similar occurrences. But then we're hearing of alfalfa fields completely destroyed. And that one made no sense. That's a legume. But definitely it was fall armyworm, and it was definitely doing what it was doing. Orchard grass started hearing complaints of that. And then when the small grains were planted, rye and things like that, completely destroyed. So we were getting a mixed bag of fall armyworms, and but it was hugely a turf pest for 2021. That was where most of the damage occurred. So, all right, a couple other things we're looking at. Insecticide resistance. With this insect, it's possible, depending on where we get it from, that they may be resistant to some of the insecticides, pyrethroids being the one of most concern because they're used most commonly. What we saw was that the pyrethroids seemed to work well still against this insect. Now with fall armyworm, any insecticide, it's tough to kill the larger larvae. So as they get closer to 5th and 6th instar, the really big ones, they're hard to kill with anything. It's just a tough caterpillar to kill. So all of them work really well against the early instars. This trial, by the way, was done on a little bit larger larvae. But all of these materials that are labeled on a lot of different crops, this was done on turf, seemed to get the job done. So it didn't look like we were looking at severe insecticide resistance issues with anything. Now I am curious to hear, I know some growers sprayed like some pastures and things like that and thought they did not get killed. So there could be a lot of factors because this was done late in the fall and it was getting a little cool. And you may have fall armyworms that are down hiding and not being susceptible to that insecticide because they're not coming out and moving around. So there's a lot of factors that could affect efficacy, but it didn't look like, now we didn't do detailed bioassays, but it looked like the pyrethroids and the other chemicals were getting the job done this year. But I'm interested to hear what others heard. Another thing that fall armyworms are heavily attacked by natural enemies. Sometimes it makes me wonder how they can keep such high numbers because so many things seem to go after invertebrates and birds. And we saw at least 50% of our caterpillars see these little white eggs that are deposited on them. That's a fly, a tachinid fly that will drop that egg hatches, and the maggot will consume the fall armyworm from the inside out and then ultimately kill that fall armyworm. 50% of them, I'm not lying, we collected them around Blacksburg. had these fall, it's like, good Lord, that's one species of parasitoid that's attacking it. And I could imagine all the predators and everything else. But I think what happens ultimately is they do play a huge role and they knock back these populations, but not before they do the damage that they do. Another thing I'll show you while I got my slides up, and I'm going to be wrapping it up here with this one. And that is like, what can we do moving forward? I know this will be maybe one of the topics. What I would like to do this year, I submitted a Virginia Ag Council grant to help equip extension agents and some golf course superintendents with the fall armyworm trap. So it's basically a bucket trap. The color doesn't seem to matter, but there are different commercial lures, and you basically, it's the males will be attracted to the trap. It's the female sex pheromone that they're attracted to, and it's synthesized, and it's a pretty affordable lure. It can last up to 30 days, sometimes longer. So basically put that lure in this bucket trap and have a kill strip in the bucket. And if we have fall armyworms and they arrive, you will catch them. I have seen traps where we monitored for 5 years, didn't catch anything. And then this was one down in Abingdon, and Phil Blevins was monitoring it. This was the last time we had fall armyworm in 2018. His trap went from 0, 0, 0, and then all of a sudden it jumped up to, he caught nearly 100 in one night. And that was kind of foreshadowing what we were going to get. And we got a fall armyworm outbreak, a little one, in 2018, at least in Southwest Virginia. So these traps are useful. It's quite often that you'll monitor it and not count anything. But I think they would be really useful if we had them around the state to kind of let everyone know, hey, we got them, and we got them in high numbers, and now everyone can be on alert and on the lookout, because the only way to effectively control them in something like turfgrass is to get them when they're tiny, and not when they're large, when they do that damage, because they can basically kill that lawn overnight when they get large. So that's all I have for the slide. So hopefully you got a little bit better understanding of the biology and what we saw this year. And I'm really interested to hear what others have seen and where we might go forward.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kuhar. I see you had one chat in the window there from Ed, and it asked why the arrows back to the winter breeding location. So I don't know, Ed, if you're still on the call, if you want to elaborate, or maybe that'll be enough for Tom to answer.
Yeah, I think I remember. So that was the one where it was moving from Texas into the Midwest and back. I believe that they feel there is a return population in the Midwest that can have a generation that develops in the Midwest, and then somehow, I don't know whether it's wind patterns or what, but can make its way back to the South. So that's a return population. So that's not something that we deal with, that I've heard of, that once they make it to Virginia, they're not returning to the South. The ones we get, they're going to die here. But yeah, that's an interesting thing. That wasn't my slide. That was one from Penn State, Shelby Fleischer, a colleague of mine, where they've studied the genetics of the populations, and they feel that there is some return from the Midwest that can go back to the Texas area. So yeah, good question though.
All right, well, if we have any other questions for Dr. Kuhar, we'll hold those to the end if he's going to be able to stay on the line with us. Next, I think we'll have Dr. Katie Payne, our forage specialist, speak. So Katie, if you're ready, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, we'll move to your presentation.
Okay. Are you all seeing the, there we go. Are you seeing the presentation mode or the presenter mode?
Presentation mode, it's full screen. Everything looks great.
Good deal.
Thanks, Katie.
So no problem. So, and fall armyworm is always a forage pest down in the southern US. So having spent some of my graduate education down at the University of Georgia, I saw what it can really do on a regular basis to Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, and everything down there. Like Tom mentioned, you rarely find one, and there's a reason why it's called an armyworm. Like in this picture, it was marching. They usually march across the field from right to left. In this picture, they start at one end and just go all the way to the other end. And before I show you all some pictures, I wanted to go through some of what we do for forages in terms of fall armyworm control. Forage is a low value crop compared to other commodity crops. So we usually recommend treatment at 2 to 3 larvae per square foot. And like Tom mentioned, they're somewhat easy to kill when they're less than 3/4 inch long with pyrethroids. And those also come at a lower price per acre. And you can get some control with multiple mode of action pesticides like Besiege, but they do come at a higher cost on the larger larvae. But if you really don't want to spray, the best advice for forages is to cut immediately. Don't wait an extra 3 to 4 days if it's going to be better before then, because they do work extremely fast going across the field and can do a lot of damage in that time. You want to cut it. Don't let it set for too long, because even though laying forage isn't as amenable to them, they can still hide under windrows for hay crops. And a general rule is to start scouting fields in late summer through a killing frost. When they, like Tom mentioned, they're not going to go back down south from here. They'll probably die here in Virginia. So I got an email from John Benner over in Augusta County, and he sent me some pictures of an alfalfa field, like Tom had mentioned, and kind of looking at it, it doesn't look too much like fall armyworm damage. Then you get in there and you can start seeing the larvae on the alfalfa plants. And you get into patches where they've completely defoliated alfalfa, which is extremely rare. Down south, they rarely touch legumes. And like he mentioned, I got 10 or 15 calls about them defoliating tall fescue and orchard grass. I'm not really wanting to touch too much of the Bermuda grass and crabgrass around here. But then, like I mentioned, you really, in this picture, I had to take a good hard look. I found 5 larvae in this picture, but I think the best you can see are these 3 right here gathered together. But and then this is not in Virginia. This was in central Kentucky. This was a sorghum Sudan grass field where a farmer went out and he saw basically this whole field has been demolished. So he decided to go ahead and cut it and get rid of the biomass rather than trying to salvage and let it regrow. So when he went to cut it, after he was done, he found the mower cover just covered and makes your skin crawl with these fall armyworms. And but yeah, those are just some of the pictures we've seen here from this outbreak and from 2021. And with forages, there can be some regrowth if they haven't completely damaged the growing points. Sometimes the plants that grow up from crowns are less affected by those pests. So give it a couple weeks before you really start planning to renovate those fields. So that's all I had.
All right, thank you, Dr. Payne. Excellent photographs. I guess we'll save questions to the end. I don't see anything in the chat window, so if you're going to be around for a little while, Dr. Payne will just open it up at the end for some questions.
I can do that.
Okay, with that being said, I think we'll go ahead and move to our next speaker. So I think next we'll have Dr. Mike Goatley present. I think he may have a few slides, so he's going to share a little bit of background on fall armyworm and turf situations. So Dr. Goatley, if you want to go ahead and share your screen. Perfect.
Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. So I'll give you a little bit of the turf perspective on fall armyworms. As Dr. Kuhar said, this was something that definitely got lots of people's attention. And my comments that I have will primarily focus on lawn care and some responses that we got from some of our industry people, and we being me, Dr. Kuhar, and Dr. Del Pozo while this was going on. And let's see now, of course, Robbie, that is not, there we go. This came from a sod farm in down in the Roanoke area, the Roanoke Valley. And we were hypothesizing, this was late. So this was late September, early October. And this was a fairly recent planting of turf type tall fescue. And of course, something like this in what is an actual production crop certainly got this grower's attention, but this was something that they told us they had never seen this type of armyworm activity either that late in that area or in the numbers that they had. So it was definitely in a new establishment, a very serious problem because of the potential to lose this entire investment in this recently seeded crop. And in this case, of course, if they miss this fall seeding window for tall fescue, they have missed their best opportunity to get this grass up and going. So again, it would have harvest implications for the following year. So again, as late as we had ever seen that in this particular year. And just to show you that Tom talked about the interesting thing that we saw in terms of preferential feeding, and for sure, tall fescues, especially turf type tall fescues, were the favored host, it seemed. But this is a picture that was sent to me of a Bermuda grass field from up in the Fredericksburg area. And you can see where those worms were kind of coming from the margins of that wooded area. And they're slowly but surely moving their way across this field. This was atypical this year, but you would get these outliers in which for some reason this pest would show up and it made its presence known on other crops. The challenge here is not that the Bermuda grass can't recover, but in this situation, we're getting close enough to this happening here. And it was the third week of September in the Fredericksburg area. What we've got now is an issue with, well, how much recovery can we get from this Bermuda grass as it essentially prepares for winter dormancy? It really did not affect the playability. It's more of a cosmetic issue. And what it did, my guess for this sports turf manager was they're going to be fine, but it definitely is, it's problematic when you think about the plant's photosynthetic machinery has been removed just at the time when it's starting to put away that last bit of carbohydrate reserve for the winter dormancy period. But again, this is Bermuda grass. and it was causing significant damage in the Fredericksburg market. But the norm, as Dr. Kuhar just pointed out, this is a lawn down in the Chesterfield area. And we showed this to our students here in class at Virginia Tech and asked them, what grass do you think this is? And they immediately said it must be warm season that's gone dormant. And I told them, look at the trees and how fully leafed everything is. And this is a tall fescue lawn, which has basically been completely obliterated by the feeding activity. In the words of the homeowner and the lawn service representative serving this literally was almost an overnight situation in which this damage occurred. And they were watching this damage basically move through this particular subdivision in this area. So I reached out, and Dr. Kuhar also had conversations. Later on, Tom can clean up anything that I misstate from my agronomic perspective. But we did see that lawn care professionals were the group of our industry folks that were most severely impacted by armyworms this year. Our golf turf people in general, they just don't take any chances. Again, it's such high value turf that most of the facilities will just budget that they're prepared. The first time they hear about this, they don't mess around. They go ahead and they treat, and they were even using some more expensive chemistries to give them some residual, and I'll touch on that in a second. But the lawn care market, especially there in Central Virginia, that Richmond area, this was a major problem. And one of our Hokie alums who works with Virginia Green Lawn Care, Mr. Tyler Green, was in regular contact with us, sharing photos and observations. And I followed up with Tyler, telling him what we're doing today. And I want to talk a little bit about turf perspective and what could he share with me. And these are some comments that Tyler made for me as someone that was living fall armyworm management there in the Richmond market. The infestations were so rapid and widespread that the lawn care operators basically dropped everything else that they were supposed to be doing at that time of year. This would be fall core aeration, last bits of fall fertilization, and to some degree even fall seeding. And the armyworm problem was so immense that they essentially had to reschedule everything else to address as the armyworm problem as best they could. The impact for them was 2 weeks of, as Tyler described it, nightmare situation. And essentially for them, it was the end of August to mid-September. But he did report that they saw what they thought was second. And in some cases, we're hearing people tell us, I think I've got third generation. But we were pretty sure that we for sure saw second generation activity in that Richmond market. And the attention that it got from the public, because again, the rapid nature of the damage, it was definitely something that resulted in their phones at all the lawn service companies literally being blown up by requests for, can you get us on your schedule? Their appearance was right at the time of when they're getting super busy with their fall aeration and seeding activities, fertilization, treatments, et cetera. But basically, he said they essentially mobilized everyone that could treat as best they could. They went into armyworm management mode, and everything else that they normally do in a standard fall program for what is primarily their tall fescue market in this area, all of that took a back seat. And again, I talked about, he said it was just nonstop phone traffic with the general public. Once they had heard about it, then any spot that they saw on their lawn, they equated with, it must be armyworm damage, I'm going to lose my grass. And he said, of course, that wasn't the case. But again, that was the public perception of how bad this problem was. So lots of extra hours for this group of folks who are already very busy at that time of year. Saturdays, most of the lawn care people will tell you that one of the reasons they go into that side of the turf industry is because for most situations, it's a Monday through Friday, unlike maybe what you encounter in the golf or sports turf management world. But this brought into play many Saturdays in order to try to manage this pest. The silver lining for the folks in that Richmond market was in that late August to mid-September outbreak was actually a little bit too early for them to have done much seeding. And he said that would have been catastrophic for them in their fall seeding market if the armyworms had occurred at that point in time to feed on all that newly emerging grass. They encountered some shortages in insecticides in terms of the demand that there was, and this was across the board with just about anything, but especially some of the less expensive treatments that were out there. And there were huge swings in product supply and availability issues, and their vendors were trying to track down product from basically anywhere they could find it due to the size, the scope of the outbreak in Virginia. And questions that this group is asking for the future, and things that Dr. Kuhar and Dr. Del Pozo and I are just reminding the LCO market is will or should they start thinking about more preventative approaches in fall armyworm management? Some of these strategies that would utilize longer residual products. Many of the golf course managers had gone this way, and they were essentially covered in treatments that they were making for white grub control that also capture the armyworm. But we're talking about very significant cost increases here that would have to be passed along to the customer. So they're thinking about it. As Tom said, this was not something that happens typically. So most of them still rely on the very effective and very inexpensive shorter residual insecticides, the pyrethroids, to do that. But this is something that these people will consider for the future. Those are my thoughts primarily from the lawn care perspective. So I'll be glad to take any questions either now or later.
All right, thank you, Dr. Goatley. I don't see any questions in the chat window at this time, so I think we'll just pause and let Dr. Taylor share some comments, and then we'll open it up at the very end for questions and discussion. So Dr. Taylor, if you're on the line with us still, if you want to go ahead and share some of your observations from the row crop side of things,
Yeah.
we'll have that now.
Hey, Robbie, it says when I try to share my screen, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Let's see, I think I may have to make you a co-host.
Okay. And largely what I have to, this was not a row crop problem. As Tom explained at the start of his presentation, we'll see a couple of different strains potentially of this insect, so that they're the same species, but their behavior is distinct. And the rice, or it's also known as the corn strain, will infest row crops. So we'll see it in corn and we'll see it in soybeans. The grass strain is what we were largely dealing with, and it eats, as you've seen for the past few presenters, golf courses and lawns. Where it can become a problem is in small grains planted in the winter or in the fall. And as those fields will come up, they won't be able to get established. Are y'all seeing that now?
Yes, ma'am. If you can just click the presentation mode, it should come up. Perfect.
Okay,
Yes,
I mean,
ma'am.
most of this has been covered already as identification. So when you see them in corn, they're sometimes confused with corn earworm. So this slide just shows you the difference in the larva and adults of those species. And Tom covered this identification head capsule comparison with that upside down Y that we used for adults. This is what we'll see when it comes into corn. It's primarily foliage feeding, whorl feeding. It takes a lot of them to really damage your yield. And we in Virginia, let me get to this one, are far enough away that our corn is up and safe from this animal in a usual year. Where I get calls about it typically will be in Western Virginia, where people are double planting silage corn. And so you'll have seedling corn really late in the summer that's not planted to make a grain yield, and it will get into it. Why we see it, because all of the corn we plant is now BT, is people are planting single gene BT hybrids, because there aren't enough like 60-day relative maturity corn hybrids. This is not a big enough market. So people are planting what's called the old Herculex 1 trait, and that's a single gene that largely the ones we see are resistant to when they show up in corn. soybean, when they hit soybean, what you're looking for is defoliation. They'll eat every leaf off every plant and then they'll attack the pods. So if you're out in your fields, this is something that should not surprise you. You will see it. You may not see the animal feeding. Again, like in turfgrass, they're feeding at night. So where you're going to scout them, where you're going to find them is at the base of the plants, curled up into small balls. How we treat for them in soybean is based on defoliation. So until you're through pod fill, you can withstand 15% defoliation. Once you're past that full seed, 50, 60%, let them take it. Again, the risk there is if those pods are still soft enough to be chewed on and they eat all the leaves. Where the grass strain can be problematic in soybean is when you have a lot of grassy weeds. So they'll eat all the grass and then they'll, which is kind of opposite to what Tom was describing with fescue. They'll eat all the grass and instead of dying, they're just like, hey, we're going to go for it. We're going to eat the soybean. So we did see a few fields like that this year. They were problematic into October. So Tom and myself were on a call for the Shenandoah region where it's like 2 weeks before Halloween and they had eaten a small grain field. So we really need to, when we're in one of these bad years, keep looking until it's significantly cold. Just don't assume it's safe because it's October 15th. I mean, I think maybe 2 years ago, it was like in the 90s on Halloween when my kids were trick-or-treating. So as long as they have the warm weather to continue these cycles, they will do so. We've had reports of control failures in small grain fields where pyrethroids did not work. I suspect that's largely because of the amount of cover they were able to get onto. They're protected from like the topical application of those sprays. And then we had a few cool nights where they weren't actively feeding. By the time they started consuming that pesticide, they were probably of a size and the residue was at a dilution where it wasn't that effective. So I don't think it was true resistance, but that application really matters. Using an adequate GPA and using a good enough pressure to blast that pesticide into where they're actually living, or potentially spraying later in the afternoon, early evening could be more effective. I think that's all I really got. I kind of tried to get out of this one because I was relieved it was not a row crop problem until it started hitting those small grains. If you're ever scouting with a farmer and you're wondering what the threshold is, it's one of those where I feel like we kind of made it up, but we generally agree 1 per square foot. And when you're dealing with armyworms, that's not hard to find. But just be aware that scouting is made difficult because you're going to need to get down on your knees and look. You're not going to just see them. But when they're out there, you should see plenty of them. Typically, I scout when I start seeing bird activity, and that's my hint. We grow wheat in North Carolina, so we typically see these in the fall. And like Tom said, I look for excuses not to spray them because the natural enemy suppression in the population is just so good. And I really like birds. And that's it, Robbie. I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Taylor, and thank you to all of our guest speakers today. A lot of great information, great photographs. So again, the presentation today has been recorded. So if anybody was not joining us on Zoom and wants to go back and see some of those slides, that the presentation has been recorded, so that will be available. We'll go ahead and open it up for questions or discussion. I'm just checking the chat window and I don't see any additional questions there. So for the folks on the call, if you have questions, observations, discussion, if you can just click the microphone in the bottom left-hand corner and unmute yourself, we'll go ahead and open it up for questions or discussion.
Hey, Robbie, this is Ed. I have a couple questions for Dr. Goatley.
Hey, Ed, good morning. Go ahead.
And I'm sure he was probably expecting me to pop on. Dr. Goatley, you brought up in your last slide a good question that had been in my thoughts, and where you mentioned putting down a preventative treatment, which could be more costly rather than waiting to see if the problem reappears again in 2022 and using the cheaper BT chemicals. What is your thought about that? Because my thought is we'd be better off not putting down extra chemicals just to potentially ward off a problem that we may see every 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, I agree, Ed. And I tell you what I'd like to do, if Tom is listening, I'd like to punt, because we might as well get the expert to respond here, because the justification that comes to my mind, I need Tom to confirm or deny it, would be that we have products that would serve that dual purpose of how we use them for grubicides that potentially can do that. So Tom, if you can clean that up for me or say you're right or wrong, I think that would answer what Ed's asking.
No, you're definitely right, Mike. And I would punt it right back to you, as I think you're the expert with everything to do with turf. But yeah, I think what we've seen too, Ed, is that as lawn care is moving away from the neonicotinoids, like Merit and some of the other products, for various reasons. But if you're in the state of Maryland, because they're banned, you can't use them on lawn care. That they have switched to diamides like acelepryn. It's got other names if it's a lawn care product. It may not be acelepryn. That's the commercial, kind of golf course type. But there's others like, Bayer. I forget what some of these different products are, but they've switched to acelepryn, chlorantraniliprole, the diamide. So it could be one of these things that they're switching anyway. And if you happen to have put that one down for white grubs, you got control of fall armyworm. It was one of these, you got lucky. And that's exactly what we saw, on these golf courses, that they weren't putting that product down for fall armyworm. They put it down for grubs, and then it provided excellent control. The other thing about that chemistry is it's pretty safe on the natural enemies and the non-targets, definitely on human toxicity. I mean, it is a really good, safe product. The drawback is expense, but going that route it may not be the worst, I guess is what I'm saying, because some people have been forced to start to use that product anyway.
Tom, is there a predictive map for fall armyworm that lawn care operators and extension personnel can monitor to see how they're moving up the coast? Or is that something that we need to look at trying to put in place, where you showed the traps being used?
Yeah, I think, this year, if we had been paying attention to North Carolina and Kentucky, they got hit before we did. And it could be one of these, but you don't know. You can't say that because North Carolina just had a fall armyworm outbreak that we're going to be right behind it 2 weeks, so everybody start treating. I think it's, in my career, Sally can comment as well. It's one of these that I could go a decade without seeing it be a significant pest problem. And I'm usually looking at sweet corn and crops like that. Not seen one in sweet corn in the longest time. They pop up occasionally on the Eastern Shore. I think Teresa may have been on the line. She can comment on Eastern Shore, but really not the huge pest problem. And then, every 10 years you get one of these outbreaks. So it's one of these, like, do we now all of a sudden equip ourselves with this incredible monitoring program for something that it's a really good question. So but I think it's not that difficult. I think if I would like to get more traps in the hands of more extension agents who don't have them right now, and definitely, like, I don't think there's a single golf course superintendent that monitors for fall armyworm, but we could have a few. And the thing is, like, I don't want to be spending my days trying to have the central site where all these data are put in, and then it gets back out to the channels of the alert. But I really think we're there, that would probably be useful. It'd be incredibly useful in years like this. We would have been onto it. Like I said, Phil Blevins in Abingdon was monitoring in sweet corn. Some of the other agents that are on here were part of the sweet corn monitoring program, where we had fall armyworm and corn earworm traps out. So Phil had his in Abingdon, and no one else had caught any fall armyworms. And then all of a sudden, we were used to zeros our third year into this program. 0 for fall armyworm, 0, 0. Yeah, I know, everyone's got zeros. Then all of a sudden, Phil got 100 in Abingdon. And then that year, like I said, like 2 weeks later, we had a sod farm in Shawsville that got hammered by fall armyworm. So that in that case, that was useful, and it's just, do we have the money? Do we have the resources to do this? But I would really like to try this year. Like I said, I submitted a pre-proposal for an Ag Council grant, where really most of the money is to just get traps and lures and try to let's see what happens. I mean, we'll try it next year and maybe for a couple of years. And I think it's a tool that we have. We might as well use it. We might as well increase fall armyworm monitoring in Virginia to prevent, some of these damages that happen. And I tell you, a lot of these, like Mike was saying, these lawn care, they went through this year, so they may be right on to, really wanting this information. So I don't know whether there's some way to get a little commercial sponsorship as well because they could really use this information. Sally, I don't know if you have any thoughts from the field crop standpoint with this, where we could tie it all together.
Yeah, and I may have to do this later or put it in the chat. So we have a My Ipm app that's for the southeastern row crop. Entomologist, really anyone that works in pest control, so pathologists also and weed scientists are on it. And we can use it to make updates to different regions. You can look at thresholds. It links you to products and uses, special considerations. It's a really comprehensive tool. What we're working on now with the Southern IPM Center is giving it a feature where it can push a notification. So like we would actually, when we put in these alerts, you wouldn't just see it when you open the app, but it could send you a text message saying, fall armyworm in Virginia turf, scout now. So I think that might be something for now on we can use to get the message out quicker. So we're not like all watching each other's Twitter feeds, and because really what ended up happening this year is we ended up putting out fires when we could have been like watching for them. I don't know. But yeah, I agree with you that communication can be done better, and that we're actively working on it in cooperation with other land grant universities in the South.
Great, thank you guys. And then I got one more last question, then I see there's some in the chat, so I won't monopolize too much. So Mike, just a quick question to see if I was correct in some recommendations to clients. We were seeing in the Richmond area some lawn care operators proactively reaching out to their customers to do treatments for fall armyworms. And I had some people reach out to me and say, is it worth the expense for me to do this? And my response was, well, does your next door neighbors have fall armyworms? And they said no. And I said, well, the fall armyworm that is out right now is not going to jump across the roads. It's not going to go across large distances as the caterpillar. So unless your next door neighbor has it, you may not want to spend the money on doing that treatment. And then I also had several say that the cost for doing those treatments was astronomical in comparison to just the general aeration and overseeding. So some of them were saying, I think I'll just take my chances, and I'm already scheduled for aeration and overseeding. And if my lawn goes, it's just a couple of weeks and then it'll be aerated and overseeded anyways. So
yeah, you gave good advice, Ed. And as Tom has said, what was so strange about this is we'll see it every year, but not this level. And the only oddball thing for this year was the numbers and the feeding habits, which normally my expectations with fall armyworm is it causes cosmetic damage. But it doesn't feed on the crowns of these plants, these tall fescues in particular, and these lawns recover. But this year, there was more of that type of damage. We even had that here at the Turf Center in Blacksburg, in the unknown that we just tell people, pay attention. If you see the lawn moving, see those birds feeding, like Sally said, that you might want to be prepared to address this if you can this year. they simply couldn't at the lawn care level because of the sheer demand. But normally, I think your advice is spot on, is you just kind of watch and see. But this was one of those crazy years where things just spiraled out of control.
Thank you, guys.
All right, I see we got a lot of discussion in the chat window, so I'll just kind of go through some of those real quick. I know one, we had a question from a master gardener there in Hanover, and the question was basically saying that they had a lot of calls for fall armyworm, but they were asking for 3 top talking points that they should share. So Angelette, I don't know if you're still on the call, if you want to unmute, but I guess you're just asking maybe for 3 highlights.
Yes, please. We had a master gardener call us and alert us because her lawn care company told her.
So my colleagues need to chime in, but I've heard what I would start with is scouting or observation, Angela, that again, pay attention to what you see, especially in terms of bird activity. And if you're utilizing in a lawn setting, I mean, the numbers we had this year, if you stood still long enough, they'd be crawling across your shoes to do that. But the norm that I see, and what caught my attention out the Turf Center, and again, the numbers that already overwhelmed us, was to look at the bird feeding activity during the middle of the day. And that definitely suggested there must be something of particular interest out there to bring all that activity to birds pecking around in the lawn.
All right, any other suggestions or comments for Angelette from the other specialists? All right, well, Angelette, I know this is going to be recorded, so if you want to use this as an educational tool, that would probably be a great resource. Next thing I saw, we kind of had Dr. Taylor answer this a little bit in the chat window, but Stephanie was asking what environmental or other factors favored the outbreak this year, and will climate change affect the frequency of this pest in the future? Dr. Taylor, I know you put in there a response. We should assume climate change will be a factor in earlier infestations, and many tropical insects are becoming problematic in new regions. Additionally, outbreaks in Virginia are associated with tropical systems. So anything to add to that, Dr. Taylor?
I mean, I think as educators, we have a responsibility to say to the public that we don't believe and we don't think that climate change is real. It is. Okay, like we're at that point, it is. And so what does it mean when it's warmer? Insects develop faster. They survive further north. They start their migration earlier. I mean, it's very temperature dependent how these animals develop and where they can inhabit. You look at how fire ants are moving across the Commonwealth. It's all climate change. They're going to live where the conditions are favorable for them to do so. It's kind of inevitable, no stopping it. And I think where we've seen these outbreaks in Virginia the past couple, well, since I've been here in 2016, it's followed a tropical system. So when we have more wind blowing from the tropics, we're going to have more of them show up. Anyway, that's me from my pedestal. One of my talking points that I preach. Climate change is, and we just need to deal with the fallout.
Yeah, I agree 100% with you, Sally. I think fall armyworm is a great poster child for, like, yeah, this is, I mean, this problem that we had was probably, you know, triggered by a lot of things that climate change have caused, and Sally hit on all of them, and it's a good chance we may be seeing this more frequently than we ever have now. So I agree.
All right, Sally, do you want to, I know you put a comment there in the chat window about the first version of the My Ipm app. Do you just want to touch on that briefly? I know you put the links in there for folks, but do you just want to give a quick explanation of that?
Yes, so it's based on a program out of Clemson. It's a very nice technology, but this is our prototype. This is where we're starting. So I encourage you, especially the extension educators on the call, to download it and see what you think and give me advice. But for right now, it will cover corn, soybean, small grains, peanut, and cotton. And you can go into different galleries based on the commodity you're interested in. You can read overviews, pesticides, pest, resistance issues. We try to be comprehensive in setting up these submenus under each under each heading. What we're working on now at the Tidewater Research Station is to expand it beyond pest management, where you will get more agronomic tips and management strategies, so it can be like more comprehensive and actually as kind of a replacement for our pest management guides and those really long publications that we just don't have the money to print every year and hand out at meetings. So we're excited about it, but it's definitely early in this development, and we want any and all feedback, positive and negative, for sure.
All right, if folks want to check that out and provide some feedback, it sounds like a great tool. So the link is there in the chat window. Just see a few more comments rolling in, and we're going to go ahead and try to wrap up here in just a second for the sake of time. I know some of our speakers have other obligations and such. Doug Horn said he experienced a similar outbreak in 1977. It was an extreme drought year, and fall armyworm came in during August. And then we've also got some questions here. Ed is willing to put up and monitor traps in several locations in Henrico and in Midlothian. So Ed, if you want to get with Tom or some of the others on that, that would be great. All right, I think that's everything. So we're just past 10 o'clock this morning, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. We appreciate everybody joining us this morning. First and foremost, thank you to all of our specialists and guest speakers this morning. The program wouldn't be possible without you all joining us and sharing your observations and educational information to everyone on this topic. So thank you to each and every one of you for joining us this morning and being with us. If you're on the call, if you have questions after the program, please feel free to reach out to your local extension agent or any of the specialists that were on the call this morning, and we'll be happy to try to get you an answer to your questions. So also just would like to take a quick moment and thank the agents that make the effort possible: Stephanie Romelchek, Laura Maxinade, Trent Jones, and Frank Long. Without their work and coordination every week, the program wouldn't be possible. So just thank you again to everybody that joins in and everybody that makes this effort possible every other week. Lastly, if you want the recording, you can see the link there on your screen. VC Ag Today videos, you can find all of our past videos as well as today's version on that link. And then also, if you'd like to evaluate the program, we'd really appreciate your feedback. Also helps us with great ideas. So you can see the evaluation link there on your screen as well. So if you could take a screenshot of that or scan that QR code, that could get you to the evaluation link. So with all of that being said, again, thank you to everyone for joining us this morning, and we will see everyone back on December the 2nd will be our next session of VC Ag Today. So look for some information on subject topics and more information on the links for that to come. So just monitor your Facebook pages and local extension offices for that information. So thank you all again, and hope everyone has a great rest of their Thursday.